I've found my people. One of the things that makes judging video games such a complicated affair is the fact that they're made up of so many different parts. But just like with any other work of art, these parts all have to be coordinated to create the right experience for the viewer. A movie can be bad if its soundtrack doesn't fit the visuals, or if the cinematography doesn't effectively show the themes of the story. But a game has so many more ways to end up as something less than the sum of its parts, to have an awkward dissonance about it. At first glance, a game like Cuphead doesn't seem like it should suffer from this problem. It has beautiful art and animation with a jaunty, period-appropriate soundtrack and great slapstick sound design. It has a story that's simple enough for a cartoon, and simple but challenging gameplay to accompany that story. In many ways, it's an extremely impressive piece of work that seems to fit together perfectly. Isn't it interesting, then, that the game's reviews haven't been overwhelmingly positive? Cuphead has had its fair share of 8s and 9s from review sites, the same review sites that reported so favorably on it while it was still in production. Could it be that Cuphead somehow failed to live up to its own potential greatness? Well, it could. In fact, it did. Cuphead is missing something. But to figure out what that something is, we're going to need context on the game's inspirations, what the creators of Cuphead saw in them, and more importantly, what they overlooked. We'll start by going back to the year Cuphead was supposedly made, according to the game itself, 1930, a banner year for the work of animator Max Fleischer. So one of the things you should know right off the bat is that in 1930, all cartoons were black and white. Heck, most live-action films back then were black and white. Technicolor was a new technology, and most directors didn't think much of it. So although a typical Fleischer cartoon from this period looks old-fashioned today, remember that back in the 30s, this was the forefront of animation. Even hearing a character talk on screen was a novelty. A few years before, all films, animated or otherwise, were silent. Fleischer's style was something that would later be called rubber hose animation, which featured exaggerated, unnatural movements and contortions. For visual gags and shock value, this style is practically unsurpassed even today. It allows the animator to stretch and bend characters until almost anything can be made to look like almost anything else. Later on, Fleischer adapted to the more realistic animation style of the early Disney features, and that change marked a turning point when animated films were changing from comical shorts into more serious feature-length productions. The creators of Cuphead probably picked 1930 as their year for two reasons. One, it's a nice round number, and two, it's the year when Fleischer's Swing You Sinners was released, a cartoon that clearly inspired a great deal of Cuphead's visuals. But what's certain is that Cuphead's style is an artifact of the early 30s specifically. Before that time, most cartoons were much simpler in appearance, and by the late 30s, the rubber hose style was practically defunct as more realistic animation became possible. Whether you're talking about Fleischer's Bimbo the Dog, Disney's Mickey Mouse, or the even earlier Felix the Cat, all these rubber hose cartoons feature a lovable but somewhat rascally protagonist who gets himself into terrible scrapes and only gets out by cleverly using the environment around him. The emphasis is on visual gags, banter between characters, and the occasional eye-popping visual spectacle meant to frighten or surprise. These cartoons were also often set to popular songs. In fact, Fleischer had a whole category of cartoons focused on music, as did Disney. Fleischer was a true animation pioneer. He invented the process of rotoscoping, put live action and animation together on the same screen, even invented that follow the bouncing ball thing that later became so popular with Disney. But now that we've seen a sample of his work, let's head back up to the present and take a second look at Cuphead. So Cuphead is ostensibly based on this platonic ideal of what a rubber hose cartoon is. The best place to start with what's missing from it, then, is what your typical cartoon has that Cuphead lacks. The earliest cartoons, back when all films were silent, still had a lot of dialogue in speech bubble form. You might wonder why a film where you can't even hear people talk would focus on dialogue. The reason is that humor has always been a big focus of cartoons. This isn't to say that all cartoons have to be funny, but most of them, including Fleischer's, were. Cuphead lacks this essential element. What dialogue there is tends to be dry and expository, and there's no dialogue at all in the sections where you're actually playing. There's a lot of whimsy in the animation of Cuphead, but no jokes, and the result is a game that sometimes feels hollow and boring. Humor is a great way to liven up an otherwise tedious stretch of gameplay. but Cuphead doesn't make use of this tool. At its heart, Cuphead is a boss rush, and that means a lot of the appeal comes from the personality of the bosses. But while these characters have a lot of visual appeal, the fact that they don't speak limits them a lot. Those little bits of text you get after failing a stage are so tantalizing. They hint at a personality that unfortunately isn't ever fleshed out. Now I imagine that some people will have a counter-argument, which is that no one wants to hear repetitive sound bites and pointless battle dialogue if it gets in the way of the game. But that wouldn't actually be a problem here, because boss fights in Cuphead are already heavily scripted. Dialogue would just be one more thing to put in. Every line could be said once and not repeated, and this would give the fights additional context and personality, without sacrificing replayability. Let me ask you a question. Did you ever watch a Bugs Bunny cartoon where the protagonist got out of a tough situation by shooting a gun hundreds of times until his opponent exploded? I certainly haven't. In fact, a shooter of any kind is practically the opposite of a cartoon. In cartoons, the protagonist wins through ingenuity, cleverness, and luck, not sheer firepower. Cuphead's single-minded approach to mechanics makes the protagonist feel like the ship from Gradius, just plugging away at an endless stream of baddies, rather than a clever cartoon. Now, it's true that this kind of inventiveness is hard to reproduce in a video game. There always has to be some structure to a game because of limited inputs, so a player can't just defeat an opponent by throwing a pie at them or something like that. But game designers have tried in the past to make games with fun, varied mechanics that resemble a cartoon. Rayman managed to capture a lot of that cartoony feel with its limbless fist-shooting protagonist, outlandish level design, and novel mechanics. Even Conker's Bad Fur Day, despite having more than its fair share of flaws, felt like a cartoon because of all the context-sensitive tools the player could use, not to mention the humor. Even with its boss rush structure, Cuphead could have changed up the mechanics every now and then with something other than a new kind of projectile flying across the screen. Clearly the developers didn't think their game needed that variety, but having a little fun with your mechanics goes a long way. So far it probably seems like I'm criticizing Cuphead for not literally being a cartoon, and that wouldn't be fair of me. An art style is just an art style, after all, and while cartoony mechanics could be fun, it's also true that Cuphead is already a fun game with its simple run-and-gun shooter mechanics. But unfortunately, I'm not done talking about Cuphead's shortcomings. Let's discuss a couple of awkward aspects of the game that have more to do with what is there than what isn't. There's a very interesting interview on GameSpot's channel where the Moldenhauer brothers talk about some of the challenges they faced making Cuphead. One thing that came up was the choice to color their cells digitally, rather than hand color them. They mentioned that they shaved off 5 years of development time by doing this, and while that might be an overstatement, I don't think it's far off the mark. Cuphead is the kind of game where apparently simple changes could create a mountain of extra work. Given that this is the case, it's a little surprising where the Moldenhauers chose to spend time, and where they didn't. Some areas didn't get much attention when they could have been made a lot better. For instance, the sparse cutscenes that show up at the beginning and end of the game and between each world are a really half-baked inclusion. This is a game all about animation, and the one part where they could have really showed this off is instead rendered in static images with captions underneath. We never get to see a truly animated Cuphead, running around, laughing, biting his nails as he rolls the dice. Instead, all these things are shown to us in a flat, lifeless picture. Would people really have been that upset if a few of the weaker bosses from Cuphead were cut so that this could happen? Cuphead's already a very short game if you play it well. It's not like being 10 minutes shorter would destroy its value. I can only conclude from this that the Moldenhauers never really cared about Cuphead as a story, and only included these cutscenes because they had to give some basic exposition. They must have had fun with the art, but it doesn't feel like they had much fun with the story. On the other hand, some parts of the game abound in gratuitous detail. The platforming run-and-gun segments don't really add much to the experience, and a much smarter idea would have been to incorporate the platforming gameplay into the boss fights, to give them some of that variety which is so sorely lacking in them. But the worst offender in this regard, in fact one of the strangest parts of the entire game in terms of design, is the fight with King Dice. There are, no exaggeration, 10 bosses in this one fight, plus a metagame mechanic with the roulette wheel. It's beyond overkill, and every time I see this fight I wonder what the resources that were lavished on it could have done if they'd been spent on the rest of the game instead. I won't deny it's impressive when it happens, but considering what it comes at the expense of, I can only think of it as waste. This fight, which has to be regarded as the climax of the game, is followed by the real final boss fight, a much less interesting encounter with a generic 1930s cartoon devil. I don't understand why King Dice, who's a far more interesting character both visually and dramatically, isn't the main villain, or why his boss fight isn't the last one in the game. After all, who makes more sense as the villain in a cartoon game about collecting gambling debts? King Dice, who has a die for a head and whose theme is gambling? Or the devil, who's just the devil, and whose theme is being evil? Cuphead doesn't have a fleshed-out story or a logical difficulty curve. Despite the 7 years it took to make, a lot of time was spent polishing things that were already good, instead of improving the least impressive parts of the experience. But it's the next point that really sums up what this game is missing. A lot of people have been misled as to Cuphead's primary influences. In fact, I probably misled you at the beginning of this video. Because the fact is that, as a game, Cuphead's primary influence is not Max Fleischer's cartoons. Or cartoons at all, really. It's this. Contra, Metal Slug, Gunstar Heroes, and to a certain extent Toho and other bullet hell shooters. These are the games that made Cuphead what it is, a run-and-gun shooter based around thrilling boss fights, severely limited health, and constant dodging around the screen. From listening to the Moldenhauer brothers talk, you can tell that they loved these games as kids and wanted to make a game just like them. In fact, they mention in the GameStop video that Cuphead as a shooter is older than Cuphead as an homage to 30s animation. Clearly, no matter the art style, Cuphead was always going to be the game it is mechanically. The problem is that Cuphead doesn't iterate much on its predecessors. It has the same kinds of guns, the same kinds of enemy projectile patterns to dodge, the same deliberately high difficulty, which turns off a lot of players while making lifelong fans of others. Visually, Cuphead is a very special game. Mechanically, it's anything but. Yet the problem goes deeper than that. Cuphead isn't that visually adventurous either. It constantly relies on either static backgrounds or basic horizontal panning. There's only one fight in the game where the map scrolls vertically, instead of horizontally or not at all. There's no bizarre scene transitions, no diagonal camera pans or other clever tricks. The best that Cuphead can come up with is the occasional 3D object rotating in the background, which is also used very sparingly, only twice, I think. And this would all be fine, except that the supposed inspiration for Cuphead is Max Fleischer, possibly the most inventive animator of his era. Fleischer was fond of using skewed camera angles, wobbly walls, and other visual spectacles that made his cartoons a sight to behold. Fleischer's cartoons weren't just a sumptuous visual treat like Cuphead, they also constantly surprised and amused the viewer. To anyone who thinks that Cuphead is more fun to watch than to play, which is something I've heard a lot by the way, you really need to watch those old cartoons from the 30s, and see not only the inspiration for Cuphead, but also a whole lot of things that Cuphead sadly never attempted. I hope that this video doesn't come across as me trying to bash the Moldenhauer brothers. Cuphead is still a remarkable achievement that deserves praise, and it's an inspiration to anyone who ever hoped to make a game from scratch, or learn how to draw from scratch. But the ambivalent reception of Cuphead is a fact, and this video is my attempt to outline some of the reasons why the game isn't as phenomenal as people thought it would be. To me, the best thing about that GameSpot interview was the end of it, when the Moldenhauer brothers talked about starting work on a new project. So many indie developers seem to rest on their laurels after a huge initial success, but it seems like Cuphead's success hasn't gone to its creators' heads. I doubt that they'll ever make the inventive, cartoonish game that Cuphead didn't end up as, but I have every confidence that their next game will leave Cuphead in the dust in terms of quality and fun. Whatever they're making next, I can't wait to see it. Seriously though, what's wrong with their noses? I mean, this is what a cup person's nose is supposed to look like. It's a freaking handle. That's how it works. What is this tumorous monstrosity?